Late winter of 1879 hit the northern Minnesota frontier like a frozen fist. When the temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, homesteader Jonas Fletcher learned what every settler dreaded. His cabin built exactly by the book was failing him. Rough-hewn logs, mud chinking, wood stove placed just right, everything the local carpenter swore would work. Cold air knifed through every gap, ice formed on the inside walls, and he burned 3 cords of wood that month just to keep his family from freezing. Across the northern plains, homesteaders in identical cabins were losing the same battle against the cold. Then Fletcher quietly applied a technique borrowed from old world traditions, something about drawing air through a buried pipe that neighbors called foolish digging. That one change stopped the drafts cold and cut his wood use nearly in half. Here's exactly how this buried air system worked and what every serious builder needs to understand about ground temperature that Fletcher figured out first. Jonas Fletcher had arrived in the Wind River Valley 3 winters before with the confidence of a man who knew timber. 20 years of logging camps from Maine to Wisconsin had taught him how to read wood grain, how to notch logs tight, and how to build a cabin that would stand against whatever nature threw at it. He had followed every rule the territorial guides preached. Select straight pine logs 8 to 10 inches across, notch them with a sharp axe to fit snug, fill the gaps with whatever mud and moss the land provided, and place the wood stove against the back wall where the chimney could draw properly. The first winter had been mild enough to mask the problems. Temperatures rarely dropped below 0, and Fletcher convinced himself that the persistent drafts around his ankles were simply the price of frontier living. But 1878 brought a harsh introduction to northern Minnesota reality. Night after night, he woke to the sound of wind whistling through gaps he thought he had sealed, and mornings revealed frost patterns on the interior walls that mapped every weakness in his construction. By the 3rd winter, Fletcher knew his cabin was bleeding heat faster than his wood stove could replace it. The mud chinking had cracked and fallen out in chunks during the previous spring's freeze-thaw cycles, leaving finger-wide gaps between logs. Cold air poured through these openings with such force that candles flickered constantly, and papers scattered across his rough-hewn table whenever the wind gusted outside. The wooden floor, laid directly on leveled earth, conducted cold up through his boots, even when he stood directly beside the stove. Most frustrating was the stove itself. Fletcher had purchased a quality cast iron model from a dealer in Duluth, one designed specifically for heating frontier cabins. Yet the harder he fed it, the more problems emerged. When he packed the firebox full of split oak and birch, the intense heat created powerful updrafts that sucked cold air through every crack and crevice with hurricane force. The stove would glow red hot, while his water bucket froze solid just 6 feet away. On the coldest nights, he burned logs so fast that sparks and embers shot up the chimney like fireworks, wasting precious fuel and creating a constant fire hazard. The cabin's interior climate swung between scorching and freezing with no comfortable middle ground. Near the stove, the air grew so hot it dried his throat and made his eyes water. But step toward any wall or corner, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees. His sleeping loft, accessed by a crude ladder, trapped all the smoke and superheated air, while remaining somehow colder than the main room below. Fletcher often woke with a splitting headache from the fumes and numbness in his fingers and toes from the cold. Fletcher's neighbors throughout the valley faced identical struggles. The Olson family 2 miles north had built their cabin using the same territorial guidebook Fletcher followed. Yet they burned through 4 cords of wood each month and still sent their youngest children to sleep at relatives' homes during the worst cold snaps. The McReady brothers, both experienced carpenters from Ohio, had constructed what everyone agreed was the finest log cabin in the region, perfectly chinked, expertly notched, and fitted with an expensive heating stove imported from Chicago. But their cabin suffered the same problems of uneven heating and excessive fuel consumption that plagued every other homestead. What set Fletcher apart was his refusal to accept these conditions as inevitable. His immigrant grandfather had described earth-sheltered homes in the old country where families stayed warm through brutal winters while using half the fuel of conventional houses. These stories had always seemed like folklore, but as Fletcher split his 5th cord of the month, he began reconsidering techniques he had dismissed as old-world superstition. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Henrik Larsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived the previous spring. Larsen mentioned that his family's farm in the homeland had drawn fresh air for their main fireplace through a stone-lined channel that ran beneath the frost line. The incoming air arrived pre-warmed by contact with the stable earth temperature, reducing the thermal shock that plagued conventional fireplaces. Fletcher had never heard of such a system, but the principle made immediate sense to a man who understood that the ground 6 feet down stayed warm even when surface conditions reached deadly extremes. When Fletcher mentioned this idea to his closest neighbor, Samuel Wright, the response was immediate and decisive mockery. Wright, who served as the informal authority on construction matters for the entire valley, declared the concept desperate foolishness from a man who's burned through his common sense along with his firewood. The local carpenter, Thomas McKenna, was even more direct. Fire heats cabins, Fletcher, not fancy holes in the ground. You'll dig yourself into bankruptcy and still freeze come January. The skepticism extended throughout the community. At the monthly Grange meeting, Fletcher's mention of underground air channels provoked open laughter from men who had built dozens of cabins using time-tested methods. They pointed out that every successful homesteader from the Atlantic to the Pacific relied on the same basic approach: tight logs, good chinking, and a proper wood stove. Deviation from this proven formula struck them as the desperation of a man who had failed to master the basics. But Fletcher had spent too many sleepless nights feeding his ravenous stove to dismiss any potentially viable solution. He had calculated that at his current consumption rate, he would need to cut and split over 40 cords of wood to survive the winter, an impossible task that would leave no time for other essential work. More importantly, he had observed that the ground beneath his cabin floor remained noticeably warmer than the air 6 inches above it, even during the coldest weather. If the earth could moderate the brutal temperature swings that tormented his living space, perhaps an underground air channel could deliver that same moderating effect to his heating system. The decision to proceed came during a particularly brutal February night when outside temperatures plummeted to -35 degrees. Fletcher woke every hour to stoke his stove, yet still watched ice crystals form on the walls beside his bed. By morning, he had resolved to test the buried pipe system, regardless of community opinion. Fletcher began construction in early March of 1879, when the frost line had retreated enough to allow digging, but before spring planting demanded his full attention. He selected a location 30 feet east of his cabin, where the ground sloped gently away from the building, ensuring proper drainage and preventing water from backing up into the pipe during heavy rains or snowmelt. The excavation proved more challenging than Fletcher had anticipated. Minnesota's clay-heavy soil, frozen solid through the winter months, required careful timing and technique. He worked during the warmest part of each day when surface temperatures climbed above freezing and softened the top layer enough for his spade to bite. Progress was measured in inches rather than feet, as Fletcher dug a trench 18 inches wide and followed the frost line down through increasingly dense clay and scattered granite stones left by ancient glaciers. At 6 feet depth, Fletcher encountered the thermal boundary he sought. Even on days when surface temperatures hovered near freezing, the soil at this level maintained a consistent temperature of approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. He tested this by leaving his thermometer buried overnight and checking it each morning for a week. The reading never varied more than 2 degrees, confirming that he had reached the zone of thermal stability that would make his system effective. Construction of the pipe itself required materials Fletcher had to source from 3 different suppliers. The pipe sections were made from fired clay tiles, each 18 inches long and 6 inches in interior diameter, purchased from a pottery works in St. Paul. These tiles featured interlocking joints that could be sealed with mortar, creating an airtight passage that would not crack under freeze-thaw stress like wooden pipes would. Fletcher ordered 24 sections, enough to span the distance from his excavation point to the cabin interior with several extras for repairs. Laying the pipe demanded precise attention to grade and alignment. Fletcher maintained a gentle downward slope from the exterior intake toward the cabin, ensuring that any moisture condensation would drain outward rather than collecting inside the system. He bedded each tile section in a mixture of sand and small stones, providing stable support while allowing for slight ground movement during seasonal freezing and thawing cycles. The exterior intake required careful engineering to prevent snow blockage and animal intrusion while maintaining adequate airflow. Fletcher constructed a wooden hood elevated 18 inches above ground level and angled to shed precipitation. Beneath this hood, he installed a mesh screen made from salvaged window screening to exclude mice and other small animals that might build nests in the warm pipe. The intake opening measured 4 inches by 6 inches, large enough to supply adequate airflow without creating excessive wind noise during storms. Inside the cabin, Fletcher modified his stove installation to integrate with the buried pipe system. He removed several floorboards directly beneath the stove and connected the pipe terminus to a simple wooden box that directed incoming air upward around the stove's base. This arrangement allowed the stove's natural draft to pull fresh air through the buried pipe rather than drawing it through cracks and gaps in the cabin walls. The first test came during a cold snap in early November when temperatures dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Fletcher sealed every visible gap in his cabin walls with strips of cloth and wooden wedges, forcing all incoming air to pass through his buried pipe system. He then built a modest fire in his stove and measured the temperature of air emerging from the pipe opening. The thermometer read 38 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 50 degrees warmer than the outside air temperature. More importantly, Fletcher could feel the difference immediately. The characteristic knife-edge sensation of cold air infiltration around his ankles disappeared entirely. Instead of frigid drafts cutting across the floor whenever wind gusted outside, he experienced a gentle circulation of cool but not brutal air. That mixed gradually with the heated air rising from his stove. The system's performance during the winter of 1879 to 1880 exceeded Fletcher's most optimistic projections. During January, when outside temperatures regularly reached minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, his pipe consistently delivered air at temperatures between 35 and 40 degrees. This 40 to 60 degree temperature differential meant his stove no longer had to work against incoming air that could freeze water instantly. Fletcher's fuel consumption dropped dramatically and measurably. Where he had previously burned 3 cords of split hardwood per month during the coldest periods, his consumption fell to approximately 2 cords. This 33% reduction freed up countless hours previously spent cutting, splitting, and hauling wood. More significantly, his cabin maintained more stable interior temperatures. Instead of wild swings between overheated areas near the stove and freezing corners, Fletcher achieved relatively even heating throughout his living space. The buried pipe also eliminated the pressure differentials that had plagued his cabin during windy weather. Previously strong winds created suction effects that pulled cold air through every available crack with tremendous force. With all incoming air channeled through the buried pipe, wind pressure at the surface could not create these uncomfortable and wasteful drafts. Fletcher documented his results with methodical precision, recording daily wood consumption, interior temperatures at morning and evening, and exterior weather conditions. His logs showed that on the coldest night of the winter, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit with 20-mile-per-hour winds, his cabin interior never dropped below 55 degrees, despite using only half the fuel he would have required the previous year. The success of Fletcher's system attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Eric Anderson, a recent immigrant from Norway, visited in February and immediately recognized techniques his grandfather had used in Scandinavia. Anderson explained that similar earth contact heating methods had sustained Norwegian farmers through centuries of brutal winters, often in regions where timber was scarce and every quart of fuel represented weeks of labor. This connection to Old World knowledge lent credibility to Fletcher's innovation among settlers, who might otherwise have dismissed it as desperate experimentation. Anderson's endorsement carried particular weight because Norwegian and Swedish immigrants had already proven themselves as some of the most successful cold-weather homesteaders in the region. By spring, Fletcher's neighbors could no longer dismiss his buried pipe as eccentric tinkering. The evidence was undeniable. Fletcher had heated his cabin through one of the harshest winters on record while using significantly less fuel than conventional systems required. Word of his success began spreading to other valleys and settlements. carried by travelers who had witnessed his comfortable cabin during the worst weather of the season. Fletcher's buried pipe had solved the air infiltration problem, but the cabin envelope itself remained a thermal disaster. Even with pre-warmed incoming air, heat poured through the walls, floor, and ceiling at an alarming rate. On calm nights when his pipe system worked most efficiently, Fletcher could feel cold radiating from the interior surfaces of his log walls. The rough-hewn timber, dried and shrunk after 3 seasons, had opened gaps that no amount of conventional mud chinking could permanently seal. The solution came through an unexpected teacher. Klaus Weber, a German immigrant who had arrived in the valley that spring, visited Fletcher's cabin during a March cold spell and immediately identified the thermal weaknesses that conventional frontier building ignored. Weber had grown up in the Black Forest region where winters lasted 6 months, and fuel wood was precious. His family's farmhouse had employed techniques developed over generations of cold climate survival. Weber explained that American settlers typically treated chinking as a simple gap filler, mixing whatever mud and moss they could gather quickly. In contrast, European builders created chinking that functioned as insulation and structural component simultaneously. The key lay in the proper mixture of clay, straw, and organic binders that created a dense, cohesive material resistant to cracking and shrinkage. Fletcher and Weber spent 2 days in April gathering materials for the improved chinking recipe. They harvested clay from a deposit Fletcher had discovered while digging his buried pipe, selecting the most plastic variety that would bind effectively without excessive shrinkage. The straw came from wheat stubble left over from the previous harvest, cut to lengths between 2 and 4 inches for optimal interlocking. Weber insisted on adding chopped cattail fiber gathered from nearby wetlands, explaining that this material provided tensile strength and prevented the clay-straw mixture from separating during freeze-thaw cycles. The mixing process required precise attention to ratios and consistency. Weber demonstrated the traditional method of combining 1 part clay with 3 parts chopped straw and 1/2 part cattail fiber, adding water gradually until the mixture achieved what he called proper plasticity, wet enough to pack tightly but dry enough to hold its shape when squeezed. Fletcher learned to test the mixture by forming handfuls into balls and observing how they held together when dropped from shoulder height. Application demanded techniques unknown to most frontier builders. Instead of simply stuffing the mixture into gaps between logs, Weber showed Fletcher how to remove all existing chinking and clean the log surfaces thoroughly. They then applied the new material in layers, pressing each layer firmly into contact with the wood and allowing it to set before adding the next. The final layer was smoothed and shaped to shed water while maintaining continuous contact with both upper and lower logs. The clay straw chinking proved dramatically more effective than Fletcher's previous attempts at sealing his cabin. Where conventional mud chinking cracked and fell out during seasonal temperature changes, the new mixture flexed and maintained its seal. More importantly, the thick layers provided genuine insulation rather than simply blocking airflow. Fletcher could feel the difference immediately when he pressed his hand against the interior wall surface. The cold radiating through the logs was noticeably reduced. Weber's second innovation addressed heat loss through the cabin's lower walls and floor. He introduced Fletcher to the Scandinavian practice of interior sod lining, a technique that added both insulation and thermal mass to the most problematic areas of the building envelope. This method involved cutting sod blocks 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 6 inches thick from areas where the grass grew densest and the soil structure was most stable. Fletcher began the sod installation in May, working systematically around the cabin's interior perimeter. He stacked the blocks grass side inward against the lower 3 feet of each wall, creating a continuous barrier between the log structure and the living space. Each layer of sod blocks was fitted tightly against the next, with joints staggered like brickwork to eliminate thermal bridging. The grass roots and organic matter in the sod provided insulation value, while the soil mass stored and released heat slowly, moderating temperature swings. Over this sod barrier, Fletcher installed a wainscot of rough pine board salvaged from shipping crates. The wooden facing protected the sod from damage and moisture, while creating an air gap that enhanced the insulation effect. The finished installation looked neat and intentional rather than makeshift, giving Fletcher's cabin interior a more refined appearance than typical frontier dwellings. The third component of Fletcher's envelope improvements involved reorganizing the cabin's interior space to conserve heated volume. Weber explained that European farmhouses typically concentrated living activities in smaller, more easily heated areas during winter months. Fletcher implemented this principle by constructing a sleeping loft above the area where his stove was located, using the natural tendency of heated air to rise. Fletcher built the loft platform from split logs laid across substantial joists hewn from pine trees on his property. The platform covered approximately one-third of the cabin's floor area, creating a cozy sleeping space 8 feet long and 6 feet wide with just enough headroom for sitting upright. Access was provided by a sturdy ladder constructed from straight-grained oak. Heavy wool curtains hung from wooden. Rings allowed Fletcher to close off the loft from the main room, trapping heated air in the smaller space during the coldest nights. The thermal performance of these envelope improvements became apparent during Fletcher's first winter with the complete system. In December of 1879, when temperatures dropped to minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, his cabin interior remained comfortable with significantly less fuel than even his improved buried pipe system had required the previous year. His daily wood consumption averaged just over 1 cord per month, representing nearly a 50% reduction from his pre-improvement usage. More importantly, Fletcher achieved even temperature distribution throughout his living space. The sod lining eliminated the cold wall effect that had previously made areas near the cabin's perimeter uncomfortable. The clay straw chinking stopped the subtle air currents that had carried heat away from the stove area. The organized loft space allowed Fletcher to retreat to an efficiently heated sleeping area during the coldest periods, while maintaining a comfortable main room for daily activities. Fletcher documented the thermal improvements with the same methodical approach he had applied to testing his buried pipe system. Interior wall temperatures, measured at multiple locations, remained within 5 degrees of each other throughout the coldest nights. Previously, he had recorded temperature differentials of 15 to 20 degrees between the warmest and coldest areas of his cabin. The integrated system of buried pipe air supply and improved envelope performance proved remarkably effective during the severe winter of 1879 to 1880. When neighbors struggled through January cold snaps that killed livestock and forced families to burn furniture for emergency heat, Fletcher maintained comfortable living conditions while using less fuel than most cabins required during mild weather. His systematic approach to thermal management had transformed a failing frontier dwelling into a model of cold climate efficiency that would influence cabin construction throughout the Northern Territories for decades to come. Fletcher's success with air supply and envelope improvements had solved the infiltration problems, but one critical weakness remained in his heating system. Even with pre-warmed incoming air and superior insulation, his cast iron stove suffered from the fundamental limitation of all metal heating devices. It released heat quickly when fed and cooled rapidly when the fire died down. During the coldest nights, Fletcher still woke every 3 hours to stoke the firebox, and by morning the cabin temperature had dropped 20 degrees despite his envelope improvements. The solution emerged through Fletcher's friendship with Dmitry Kozlov, a Russian immigrant who had settled in the valley that autumn. Kozlov had grown up in a region where winter temperatures regularly reached minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and fuel wood was scarce enough that families planned heating strategies like military campaigns. His grandfather had been a master mason who specialized in constructing massive heating stoves that burned wood efficiently and retained heat for 12 to 15 hours after the fire died. Kozlov explained that American settlers typically treated stoves as simple fireboxes, designed to burn fuel and radiate heat immediately. Russian builders understood stoves as thermal storage devices that captured and slowly released the energy content of wood over extended periods. The key lay in surrounding the firebox with sufficient masonry mass to absorb heat during combustion and radiate it back into the living space long after the flames had died. Fletcher began construction of his thermal mass system in September of 1880, gathering materials throughout the late summer and early fall. He quarried fieldstone from a granite outcropping 2 miles from his cabin, selecting pieces that ranged from fist-sized to blocks weighing over 50 pounds. The stones needed to be dense and free of cracks that might cause them to split when heated and cooled repeatedly. Fletcher also collected several wagon loads of clay-rich soil for mortar and purchased lime from a supplier in Duluth to create mortar that would withstand extreme temperatures. The hearth foundation required excavation beneath Fletcher's existing stove installation. He removed the stove temporarily and dug a pit 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet long, extending well beyond the stove's footprint. This foundation was filled with carefully fitted stones laid in lime mortar, creating a solid base that would not shift or settle under the weight of the massive hearth structure. Construction of the thermal mass hearth demanded techniques Fletcher had never attempted. Kozlov guided him through the process of laying stones in courses, with each layer bonded to the next using lime mortar mixed with sand and chopped straw. The hearth platform measured 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and rose 18 inches above the cabin floor. The top surface was finished with flat stones fitted so tightly that the joints between them measured less than 1/4 inch. Above this platform, Fletcher and Kozlov constructed a fireback wall using the largest stones in their collection. This wall rose 4 feet behind where the stove would sit and extended 2 feet beyond the stove on each side. The fireback was built 18 inches thick, creating enormous thermal mass directly behind the firebox. The stones were laid with minimal mortar joints to maximize heat transfer and fitted so precisely that the wall appeared almost seamless. The most critical innovation involved modifying the stove's exhaust system to capture heat that conventional installations sent directly up the chimney. Kozlov showed Fletcher how to construct a series of internal baffles using thin stone slabs and iron plates salvaged from agricultural equipment. These baffles forced the hot exhaust gases to travel through a serpentine path within the masonry mass before reaching the chimney, transferring much more of their heat content to the stones. Fletcher installed iron dampers at 3 points in the modified flue system, allowing him to control the path that exhaust gases took through the thermal mass. During initial firing, he could open bypass dampers to establish strong draft and prevent smoke from backing up into the cabin. Once the fire was burning well, he could close these bypasses and force the hot gases through the longer path that maximized heat transfer to the masonry. The modified stove placement created a natural convection system that distributed heat evenly throughout Fletcher's cabin. Cool air entered through his buried pipe system and was drawn toward the stove base by the natural draft created when heated air rose toward the loft. This air heated as it passed around the massive stone hearth, then rose to warm the loft area before cooling and descending along the exterior walls to complete the circulation pattern. Fletcher's first test of the complete thermal storage system came during a November cold snap when temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. He built a fire in the modified stove at 6 o'clock in the evening, maintaining it for 3 hours until the stone hearth and fireback wall were thoroughly heated. By 9 o'clock, the stone surfaces were too hot to touch comfortably, indicating that they had absorbed substantial thermal energy. Fletcher allowed the fire to burn down completely and measured the cabin's temperature at hourly intervals throughout the night. At midnight, 3 hours after the last flames had died, the interior temperature had dropped only 5 degrees from its peak. By morning, 12 hours after he had stopped feeding the stove, the cabin remained 15 degrees warmer than outside temperature, and the stone hearth was still noticeably warm to the touch. The fuel efficiency gains proved even more dramatic than Fletcher had hoped. During December of 1880, his first full month with the thermal storage system, he burned an average of 25 cords of split hardwood, a reduction of nearly 50% compared to his previous winter's consumption with the improved envelope alone. More significantly, Fletcher found he could maintain comfortable interior temperatures by building just one substantial fire each evening, eliminating the exhausting routine of nighttime stoking that had plagued his previous winters. The thermal mass system also provided superior temperature stability during the most severe weather. When a January storm brought temperatures down to -38 degrees Fahrenheit with sustained winds over 30 miles per hour, Fletcher's cabin interior never dropped below 55 degrees, despite his building only one fire per day. The massive stone hearth absorbed heat during the evening firing and released it gradually throughout the following 24 hours, moderating temperature swings that would have made the cabin uninhabitable with conventional heating. Fletcher documented these results with the same precision he had applied to testing his earlier innovations. Daily wood consumption averaged just over 3/4 of a cord during the coldest months, while interior temperatures remained within a 10-degree range regardless of external conditions. The thermal storage system had transformed his heating from a constant battle against the cold into a manageable daily routine that provided reliable comfort with minimal fuel consumption. The integration of thermal mass with Fletcher's buried air system and envelope improvements created a heating solution that exceeded the performance of any conventional frontier cabin. Visitors who experienced Fletcher's comfortable interior during brutal winter weather could no longer dismiss his methods as unnecessary complications. Word of his innovations spread throughout the territory, carried by travelers who had witnessed firsthand the dramatic difference that systematic thermal management could make in cold climate survival. The ultimate test of Fletcher's integrated heating system came during the winter of 1881, when a massive Arctic storm system settled over the northern territories and refused to move for nearly 2 weeks. The blizzard arrived on January 15th with winds exceeding 40 miles per hour and temperatures that plummeted to minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike typical winter storms that lasted 2 or 3 days, this system maintained its grip on the region with relentless ferocity that pushed every heating system to its absolute limits. Fletcher faced this crisis with systematic preparation that conventional settlers had never considered necessary. In early January, before the storm's arrival, he had inspected every component of his heating system and performed maintenance tasks that would have been impossible once the brutal weather began. He cleared accumulated debris from his buried pipe intake, checked the clay joints for any cracking that might allow air leakage, and tested his stove dampers to ensure they operated smoothly under the stress of extreme temperature differentials. Most critically, Fletcher had developed a fuel management strategy based on 2 years of experience with his thermal mass system. He calculated that the storm would require him to maintain 1 substantial fire per day for 14 days, consuming approximately 10 cords of split hardwood total. He had prepared this quantity in advance, splitting the wood into uniform pieces sized specifically for his modified stove and storing it in a shed attached directly to his cabin to eliminate the need for dangerous trips to an outdoor woodpile during the storm. When the blizzard struck with full force, Fletcher's aged neighbors found themselves fighting a losing battle against conditions that overwhelmed conventional heating methods. The Olson family, living in a standard log cabin with traditional mud chinking, burned through their entire monthly wood supply in the first 5 days of the storm. Samuel Wright, the local carpenter who had previously mocked Fletcher's innovations, was forced to burn furniture and sections of his interior wallboards to maintain barely survivable temperatures in his cabin. The McCready brothers, whose supposedly superior cabin construction had been the pride of the valley, discovered that their expensive Chicago stove could not overcome the thermal losses of their building envelope. They maintained fires around the clock, burning wood as fast as they could split it, yet their interior temperatures dropped to near freezing during the worst nights. By the storm's second week, they had exhausted their fuel supply and were forced to abandon their cabin temporarily, seeking shelter with relatives 20 miles to the south. Fletcher's integrated system performed with remarkable stability throughout the crisis. His buried pipe continued to deliver pre-warmed air at 38 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit even when surface temperatures reached their lowest points. The clay straw chinking and interior sod lining prevented heat loss that would have made the cabin uninhabitable, while his thermal mass hearth stored and released heat with mechanical precision that required no nighttime attention. During the storm's most severe phase, when winds created ground blizzard conditions that made outdoor movement deadly, Fletcher documented his cabin's performance with meticulous attention to detail. Interior temperatures remained between 58 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the 14-day period, varying only with the daily cycle of evening heating and gradual overnight cooling. His single daily fire, built at 6 o'clock each evening and maintained for 3 hours, provided comfortable warmth until the following evening. The fuel efficiency of Fletcher's complete system proved extraordinary under these extreme conditions. He consumed exactly 9 3/4 cords of wood during the entire 2-week storm, less than many conventional cabins burned during a typical week of winter weather. More importantly, Fletcher never felt compelled to build emergency fires or wake during the night to stoke his stove, maintaining his normal sleep schedule throughout the crisis, while his neighbors suffered from exhaustion caused by constant fire tending. Fletcher's system demonstrated a crucial advantage that no individual component could have provided: thermal resilience created by the interaction of all improvements working together. The buried pipe prevented cold shock to his heating system, the envelope improvements retained the heat his stove produced, and the thermal mass smoothed out temperature variations that would have created uncomfortable living conditions and excessive fuel consumption. During the storm's final days, Fletcher made a discovery that would influence his future modifications to the system. He noticed that the thermal mass hearth had developed a temperature gradient, with the stones closest to the firebox remaining significantly warmer than those at the edges. This observation led him to experiment with strategic placement of iron plates within the masonry to improve heat distribution throughout the thermal mass, a refinement that would increase the system's storage capacity by approximately 15%. When the storm finally broke on January 29th, the contrast between Fletcher's situation and his neighbors became undeniably clear. Fletcher emerged from the crisis with adequate fuel supplies remaining and his cabin in perfect condition, ready to continue normal winter operations without any emergency measures. His neighbors, however, faced weeks of recovery work, repairing damage caused by overheating their stoves, replacing furniture they had burned for fuel, and scrambling to replenish depleted wood supplies. The aftermath of the 1881 storm marked the beginning of quiet but steady adoption of Fletcher's techniques throughout the Northern Territories. Eric Anderson, the Norwegian immigrant who had previously endorsed Fletcher's methods, began construction of his own buried pipe system that spring. Two other families in the valley requested Fletcher's assistance in improving their cabin chinking using the clay-straw mixture Klaus Weber had taught him. More significantly, traveling merchants and territorial officials who had witnessed Fletcher's comfortable cabin during the storm carried detailed descriptions of his innovations to other settlements. Letters describing the buried pipe system and thermal mass heating began appearing in territorial newspapers and settlers' guidebooks published in St. Paul and Minneapolis. These accounts emphasized the practical benefits rather than theoretical principles, focusing on measurable fuel savings and improved living conditions that appealed to cost-conscious homesteaders. Fletcher's innovations also attracted attention from unexpected sources. A timber company supervisor who had stayed overnight in Fletcher's cabin during the storm was so impressed with the heating efficiency that he arranged for company carpenters to study the thermal mass construction techniques. Within 2 years, several logging camps had incorporated modified versions of Fletcher's hearth design into their bunkhouses, achieving significant fuel savings and improved worker comfort during extended winter operations. The legacy of Fletcher's systematic approach to cold climate heating extended far beyond individual technique adoption. His methodology, identifying specific thermal problems, researching traditional solutions, testing modifications systematically, and documenting results precisely, established a model for practical innovation that influenced frontier building throughout the late 19th century. Settlers learned that combining old world knowledge with careful experimentation could produce dramatically superior results compared to simply copying standard frontier practices without understanding their limitations or potential improvements.